Luciana Souza e Marcel Camargo, on May 25th at the Nimoy. Joining nominated vocalist Luciana Souza and guitarist Marcel Camargo unite for New Moon, a spellbinding journey of voice, guitar, and strings. Blending Brazilian roots with bold new compositions, they create an intimate, soul-stirring sound that invites you to listen closely and feel deeply. Further information and tickets at cap.ucla.edu and kpfk.org.
Que nenhuma terra tem. Você já foi à Bahia?
Support for KPFK comes from the screening of the documentary Steal This Story on Friday, April 17th, 2026, as a fundraiser for KPFK. The event takes place at the Langley Royal in West Los Angeles with a screening at 1:10 p.m. and 7:10 p.m. Democracy Now! Host Amy Goodman will be in attendance for a Q&A session alongside filmmakers Carl Deal and Tia Lesson. Information and full event details are available at kpfk.org.
KPFK 90.7 FM Los Angeles. Welcome to Cut to the Chase. My name is Sylvestor Rivers, and my privilege to welcome an author. I think you're an activist. I'm not going to ask you that, but hopefully your books are activists. I can say that. Stephen Kinzer. We want to talk about his book, Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. I looked at that title and I wasn't sure what it meant. And I said, oh, this is going to be a boring book, but it was not. It had a lot of information in it. It was filled with history and things that brought up memories for me. So I really appreciated what you did on the book. But let's start with this. I'm going to read a quote from your book, and then I want you to comment on it. It says, commitment, this is at the end. We're going to start at the end and go back to the beginning. Commitment to a cause provides the ultimate justification for immoral acts. Patriotism is among the most seductive of those causes. If it posits the nation as a value so transcendent that anything done in its service is virtuous. This brings into sharp relief what the essays Jan Cott called the discrepancy between the moral order and the order of a practical behavior. Whew. So, looking at today's atmosphere, would you say that's apropos to what's going on?
Absolutely. Morality and ethics and justice were never actually central principles of American foreign policy, but we at least pretended they were and made gestures in that direction and seemed to pay some attention to international norms, even though we were the ones that were setting them. Now that all seems to be gone. So I have no problem with governments setting their policies in their own interests. In fact, I think that's the only responsible, reliable way to set your foreign policy. But you have to do it with a realization of what is really in your country's long-term interests, and not do things that make you feel good for a short time because you're triumphing over your supposed enemy. But in the end, actually end up not only harming the target country, but also undermining your own security. So it's true that whipping up nationalist fervor has always been a tool of leaders. And hand in hand with that goes demonizing the enemy. You can never recognize any positive arguments on behalf of the enemy or grant them any legitimate security concerns. So you have this combination of whipping up the fervor of your own tribe and then focusing it against an outsider. That was the essence of the Cold War order. And at the heart of that Cold War order was the CIA. And the project that my book, Poisoner in Chief, is about, the mind control project called MK Ultra, was somewhere deep in the heart of the CIA. So you can't understand it without understanding these larger concerns that I brought up in that quote that you just read from the end of my book.
Yeah, let's look at some of those larger concerns. One of the concerns, when at the beginning of the book, you talk about the Nazis and how the United States actually employed the Nazis to for scientific research. You want to talk about that? In other words, they were going on trial because of the disease things that they did, but then they said, okay, let's use them. So they brought them into the fold and even made some of them citizens. Is that correct?
It's a fascinating story. So after World War II, one of the main occupations of the US intelligence service in Germany was rounding up Nazis and getting the higher ranking, more guilty ones of them prepared for trial. But there were a number of loopholes. The Americans began to realize very quickly that they could make use of some of the Nazi officers. The first ones to be admitted were ones who were involved in the ballistic missile program, the ones who had designed the V-2 rockets that rained down on London and other European cities during the war. So they were brought over, the former Nazi rocket scientists, to the United States and actually became crucial in the US space program. Werner von Braun, who was the head of the space program in its peak of development during the Kennedy era, had been working for the Nazi army during the Second World War. So that was the first group, rocket scientists. The second group was intelligence officers. One of the things that we realized after the end of the Second World War was that our new enemy was the Soviet Union, but we didn't know anything about the Soviet Union. We had no agents there. And the reason was, of course, that we had been allies during the war. So anybody who was anti-Soviet Union would never have been in contact with us because we were allies of the Soviet Union. Suddenly we were enemies. How do we find the subversive people in Eastern Europe and inside the Soviet Union? Well, the Nazi intelligence officers knew all those people because they were working with them during the war. So the spies, the Nazi intelligence apparatus became very valuable to the CIA. That became the second group of Germans who came to work for the United States. And then the third group is the group I concentrate on my book, in my book, Poisoner in Chief. So this guy who was put in charge of this MK Ultra program aimed at finding secrets of mind control was a scientist, and is thinking like a scientist. He came up, first of all, with the principle that if you want to find a way to put a new mind inside a person's brain, the first thing you have to do is figure out how to destroy the mind that's in there. So he wants to find ways to destroy a human mind or a human body or a human spirit. Second thing he concludes is, like a good scientist, as I'm starting my project, let's see what information is out there. How much research has been done on how do you destroy human beings? How much poison of what kind does it take? How many veins do you have to cut? Can you inject certain things? These are things that we'd like to know, but we've never, you have to conduct such murderous experiments. We don't have this information. So who has that information? The Nazi doctors who had worked in the concentration camps and tortured so many people to death, along with their Japanese counterparts who in some cases were involved in even more atrocious acts. So the CIA brought these people into MK Ultra. And I'll tell you, while I was working on
MK Ultra, let's say the folk, MK Ultra is the program that they created to do this mind control, correct?
Exactly. That was the
Okay, go ahead.
name of the CIA search for mind control. And while I was researching Poisoner in Chief, I went to Germany and I found what I think might be the first CIA secret prison. I have a photograph of it in my book. It's a nice chalet out near Frankfurt. When I got there, there was a young German businessman who had just bought the whole mansion and he was breaking it up into condos. We had a nice chat. He knew exactly what had happened there. And he said the people in the neighborhood are all aware. And they say that in the forests here where they buried the victims of MK Ultra experiments, those are all now covered over with shopping malls and apartment blocks. Anyway, the guy took me down into the basement of this building to see the storage rooms. And he said, these used to be the cells where the CIA investigators and their Nazi counterparts carried out the experiments that were actually just continuations of the ones they had been doing only a few years previous, just down the road. So yeah, the Nazi scientists played an important role in the foundation of this MK Ultra project.
Wow, that's interesting. So you said something, you mentioned excuse me, my mind is going all over the place because there's so much information that I want to share. You mentioned that in the book, it talked about the enemy was, and I want to know if you could say why. The enemy was the Nazis, but then it changed to China and Russia. Why did it change almost overnight, it seems like?
I think
guess the Soviet Union at the same time.
In the minds of many Americans, including many American leaders, the U.S. always had more in common with Germany. So the Nazi period was looked back at as kind of an unfortunate parenthesis in the fact that both of us were at heart anti-Marxist, anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik, and that was going to be the enduring tie. So I think also there's been a long history in the West going back 200 years of what's called Russophobia, looking at Russia as the eternal enemy.
200 years, you say. Wow, go ahead.
Yeah, well, it all began with the British who were engaged in all their imperial adventures trying to capture India, all those Central Asian provinces in Turkestan, and often their imperial interests were conflicting with those of Russia. And so there were various conflicts. One of them is the one we now call the Crimean War. That was one of those wars between Britain and Russia. And so in order to whip up pro-war sentiment in England, the government and the press launched a major campaign to depict everything evil as being epitomized by Russia. And that was very effective. And in many ways, we haven't progressed beyond that. The idea that there's a line between civilization and Russia, that Russia is kind of the barbarian horde, is something that is pretty deep in the Western mind. And I think we've thought of them, particularly since the Russian Revolution, as the epitome of the anti-America. It's the enemy of everything we believe in. And it's very difficult to persuade people of any kind of subtlety or a different understanding. But creation of enemies has always been an important role for government, and ours is certainly very good at it.
Wow. So let's go back to, so you have the Nazis, they got these scientists working for them, and they have this MK Ultra going on. But I want to go back to an experiment that was done in the United States, because they saw the Russians, they wanted to keep up with the Russians because they were the new enemy at that time, the Soviet Union. So they were using biowarfare. Talk about they being the United States government, dropped biochemicals on a city in the United States.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It's really, it's a remarkable story that I tell in Poisoner in Chief. So the city was San Francisco. And it was chosen in part because there's often a lot of fog there. And it was thought that the fog from the CIA mists wouldn't be noticed quite so much. So the CIA was involved in all kinds of bio-related projects. And one of them was the idea of somehow using a mass poison or a mass psychoactive drug on a population. They wanted to find out if this was feasible. And so in order to do a test, they commandeered a Navy ship and they reconfigured it. This is a huge, very expensive, very ambitious project. And they put all these ventilators in. And what they wanted to do was see if it was possible to propel large amounts of dust over an entire metropolitan area. And so they chose one that was just a benign substance. And they actually did spray it over a huge area, but it turned out not to be so benign. While I was researching this crazy episode, I also came up with an article that had been written in a medical journal a couple of years later by some doctors in a San Francisco hospital. And they reported about 8 or 10 very similar but totally unusual cases of some chemical poisoning. And up to this moment, we have never been able to figure out what was the origin of this. So only decades later did it become clear that the CIA was spraying San Francisco in some kind of a test to see how it could disperse small particles. And actually, although it tried to use a substance that wasn't toxic, actually a few people didn't get the message and got quite ill.
Wow. Oh, testing over. We always hear these things. They're killing their own people.
And nobody in San Francisco was informed. Like the mayor didn't know. Nobody, the CIA didn't tell anybody.
Wow. So this reminds me, just jumping forward real quick, then we'll go back. There was, it's been maybe a few decades ago, where they were spraying malathion in Los Angeles to stop the medfly. But with all this deceit, and people weren't going for it, say, oh, it's safe, but cover your cars. It's safe, but cover your playground equipment. Do you remember that?
Yeah, vaguely. I remember.
So I don't know if it's connected, but we were all skeptical. But our skepticism was real, seeing that they sprayed over San Francisco, a U.S. city, with the people not even knowing about it, and it did create some problems in that city. But then you go back. So this whole thing, I think, in your book, it started in the 50s, where they wanted to keep up with the Russians. They thought mind control was real, and so they wanted to do mind control. And that's in your book. It says Sidney Gottlieb. Tell us, who is this guy, Sidney Gottlieb?
The CIA went into a panic for various reasons in the early 1950s. It feared that the Soviets or communism somewhere had discovered the secret of mind control. And what it meant was that if you could seize control of people's minds, needless to say, that's something that would deliver you the prize of global mastery. So the CIA misinterpreted a few events to think that the Soviets were doing this. And so then they decided we have to do the same thing. We have to launch a program to find out how to control people's minds. And they hired this guy, Sidney Gottlieb, who was a chemist, to be the head of MK Ultra, as the project was called. Now, Sidney Gottlieb was a fascinating figure. At that time, in the early 50s, almost all of the senior CIA officers were cut from the same cloth. They all went to East Coast prep schools. They went to the same Ivy League schools. They worked at the same law firms and investment banks and dated the same girls and went to the same country clubs. It was a really closed, waspy elite. However, Sidney Gottlieb was completely different from this. This guy was the son of Orthodox Jewish immigrants from Central Europe. He had a limp. He stuttered. He'd gone to Hebrew school. He went to City College. He was so different from the rest of the people at the CIA. And I later came to believe that maybe one of the reasons for this was that the guys in the CIA feared or knew that this guy was going to have to do some terrible, bloody things. And maybe they didn't want to soil their hands with this. And if things went wrong and they had to blame it all on him, they didn't want it to be one of their own. So they brought in this outsider, and then he turned out to be an outsider in a very different way. So he became effectively the most prolific American torturer of his generation, considering the so-called experiments that he carried out. However, in his private life, he was so different from the ordinary US civil servant in the 1950s. He didn't live in some ticky-tacky development. He lived in like an eco cabin deep in the Virginia woods. He wrote poetry. He studied Zen Buddhism. He got up before dawn to milk his goats. He carried his own vegetables to work for lunch. So he was a very unusual person. And I sometimes ask myself, how can you go from carrying out these grotesque experiments around the world, watching people being horrifically abused and killed, and then at home be this kind of gentle proto-hippie? And it was almost as if maybe when he drove over the bridge from Washington to Virginia, that would be like a snake that would leave his skin behind, and he would kind of go through some transformation. But it really was a study in psychology to see how Gottlieb had these dual identities. And then he went on through the whole 1950s to be the head of this MK Ultra mind control project. And for that, he was able to travel to other countries, particularly those that were occupied by the United States after the Second World War, like Germany and Japan and Korea and the Philippines. And actually just have the local CIA station requisition prisoners from the military police. And people would be brought in to some place like this house I visited in Germany. People who were thought of as being spies or refugees who had no contacts and nobody would miss. And they would be just used as subjects for experiments. So Gottlieb went through the whole 1950s, trying every combination of drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, anything that he thought he could do to wipe people's minds away. And unfortunately, he succeeded with a number of those victims and left a lot of horrifically wounded souls and bodies behind.
So they went to Germany partly because they couldn't get clearance in the United States, and they wanted to, like, a safe house in Germany. And you were there, oh my goodness. And you saw it. I'm going to post a picture on this video. I'll put it up of that. But then, so he was, you say torture. When you say torture, what type of torture, and who are the victims?
Well, for example, in Germany, at this house that I visited, the people who were delivered there to be subjects were known as as expendables. In other words, they were people that wouldn't be missed. And so they would be taken into one of these cells and then subjected to all sorts of abuse. Now, when Gottlieb left the CIA 20 years later, he and his boss agreed that they should destroy all the MK Ultra files. That's a federal crime. It's a felony to destroy federal property. However, that's a much smaller crime than the crimes that would have been revealed in those documents. So from their point of view, they did the right thing. However, from our perspective as historians, unfortunately, we can only see the tip of the iceberg of what MK Ultra was and what Gottlieb did. However, we do know about some experiments, and we can put some things together, which I tried to do in Poisoner in Chief. And so here's something that might have happened if you put together some of the reports. They would take some guy and place him into a coffin-like closet. Then they would inject him with extreme doses of amphetamines, so he become hyperactive. And then when he reached the state of hyperactivity, they would inject him with narcotics that would send him into a coma. And then when he was in the in-between phase, between hyperactivity and coma, they would inject him with various drugs, meanwhile keeping him locked inside this cabinet, and then perhaps also subjecting him to extreme heat or cold inside there to see how much a person could take. And could you then get a person out with an empty mind that you could then use as a subject to put a new mind into? And of course, oftentimes they just went too far. Oh, that one didn't work. I guess we should try another combination. And when that guy who owns the house told me that his neighbors reported that bodies were buried in the neighborhood, those were the expendables. And Gottlieb was able to do that himself and through the people that he supervised in various countries. And as you said, there were MK Ultra experiments in the United States, but they were not so extreme, because once you got to a country that was under military occupation by the United States, you were much freer. You did not have to respond to any law that you'd have to worry about in the United States.
But they were pretty, they were pretty extreme in the U.S. though, however, is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So where did they get these victims? And I heard a lot of the black prisoners were unknowingly used, or maybe even knowingly.
Well, there's one of the few cases that we know about is actually quite chilling that happened in the United States. This happened in the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky. Now, of course, Gottlieb loved using, had a good relation with prison wardens and loved using prisoners, because obviously they are subjects and they don't have free will, and maybe they can even think they'd get something from cooperating, or they certainly could be in trouble if they didn't cooperate. So we have this case that happened in Lexington where Sidney Gottlieb was interested in experimenting with LSD. He was fascinated with LSD. In fact, thought that at one point this could be, as one of his co-workers put it, the key that could unlock the universe. That is the secret of mind control. Actually, later on, he gave up on it because he realized that it was too unpredictable. But at this point, he was interested in seeing if massive doses of LSD could work the trick of destroying a person's mind. And so he had this prison warden segregate 7 African-American prisoners and put them into a cell together and feed them what were described as triple and quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days.
Triple and quadruple, was this knowingly? I mean,
no. I think, as far as we know, they had no idea what was happening to them. And now we don't have any follow-up, but as I've been thinking about this episode, I'm always haunted by the question of what happened to those poor guys. Did they ever? Certainly, if the question was, would that amount of LSD over that amount of time destroy your mind? I guess the answer would be yes. So what happened to them? Did they die in Lexington prison? Did they get out? Did they ever have any idea that it was something that was put in their water and it wasn't just them? I mean, did they just, what could have been their futures? Anyway, those were the kind of people that were the US version of the Expendables. And those that fell into MK Ultra's net, many of them suffered greatly.
So this was unknowingly that they were drugging these folks back in the 50s, 60s, and using LSD.
Yes, well, the MK Ultra was at its peak in the 1950s. So the LSD part of the story is particularly interesting because it's part of the unexpected, certainly unpredicted impact of MK Ultra. So as I said, Gottlieb was one of the first people to notice that LSD had been invented in Switzerland right after the Second World War. And he actually, in 1951, convinced the CIA to buy the entire world supply of LSD from the Sandoz Chemical Company, which manufactured it and wanted to get rid of it. So the CIA actually got the world's store of LSD. And then Gottlieb used it in two ways. One was in these horrific experiments on unknowing victims, like the one I just described. But he also wanted to find out how ordinary people would respond to LSD, being told exactly what they were getting and having it done in a clinical setting. So since the CIA doesn't have its own clinics, it offered hospitals and clinics around the United States a deal. Would you like to test out for us this new psychoactive drug, LSD? We'll pay you for these experiments. And what you will do is very openly advertise for people, tell them exactly what it is. You can pay them. And then you would bring them in and give them this and then monitor their reactions and send us the reports. So a lot of hospitals picked up on this, and including some in California, because it was a moneymaker. And they didn't even realize that these foundations that were offering the grants were the CIA, that they were bogus front groups that were making these offers. So who were among the first people that came in to volunteer to try this new psychoactive drug? Well, one of the first was Allen Ginsberg, the great beat poet who went on to become like a high priest of LSD. Another was Ken Kesey, who wrote that counterculture Bible, the One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And actually, I saw an interview with Ken Kesey in which he said that it was true. He went to work in a mental hospital on which he based that book. But he said, the reason I went to work there was not to get material for the book. It was so I could steal the LSD out of the pharmacy, which I did, and then brought it home to all my friends. Another one was Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead. So these were the very first people that got LSD, and they got that in a legal setting, but they had no idea until years later that the LSD they had taken had come from the CIA. Now, the irony of all this is that through those people, LSD leaked into the whole counterculture. So therefore, the drug that the CIA hoped would give it the possibility of controlling the world actually wound up fueling a generational rebellion that was aimed at destroying everything the CIA stands for.
Wow. So you're saying the Grateful Dead, so they were taking this drug, LSD. I remember when I was in college, oh my God, drugs were everywhere. Nobody knew where they were coming from. Nobody knew anything. But now we know it was the CIA who was trying to use these drugs for mind control.
You know, I'll tell you, in my research for Poisoner in Chief, among the many things I read, I found an interview with John Lennon. And John Lennon was asked about LSD. And he said, we must never forget to thank the CIA. And he had never heard of Sidney Gottlieb. Nobody ever had. He lived in total anonymity. But if he had known about him, John Lennon would have said, we must always remember to thank Sidney Gottlieb, because unknowingly, Gottlieb was the first LSD guru through whom LSD penetrated the entire American counterculture.
Wow. We're talking to Stephen Ginzer, his book, Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. You say Poisoner in Chief. I would think and Chief, but why in Chief? Just something that I was thinking about.
I modeled that on the phrase Commander in Chief.
Gotcha.
And also in one of Gottlieb's jobs as head of the chemical branch of the CIA, which he did at the same time that he was running MK Ultra, was to make poison pills. So these pills had several uses. For example, they would be used when we parachuted commandos into Tibet to fight the Chinese. We gave each of them a poison pill to eat. Sometimes we had traitors inside foreign governments who were afraid that they would be arrested. And at the moment of arrest, they wanted to kill themselves. So they needed a poison pill. In addition, the CIA needed poison pills to use against foreign leaders. There were poison pills that necessary to kill Fidel Castro. Also poison to try to kill Patrice Lumumba, the prime minister of the Congo. There was an attempt to poison Zhou Enlai, the Chinese prime minister. All of these poisons were made by, logically, the chemical division of the CIA. The director of that division was Sidney Gottlieb. So he probably knew more about poisons than any living human. I mean, this guy, they were extracting poisons from thousands of Alaskan butter clams and taking out the inner organs of tropical animals that contain substances and going on mushroom hunts in Mesoamerica. This guy was Mr. Poison. He knew everything about poisons. And that's why I thought it was appropriate to call the book Poisoner in Chief. And I'll tell you another little story, since you're talking about the cover of the book. One of the great breakthroughs I had when I was working on this book was I got something nobody had, which is an actual photo of Gottlieb, because Gottlieb was a man without a face. Nobody even knew he existed. But I got the CIA to release a photo of him. And I was very excited, and I emailed my publisher and said, I've got our cover picture. You won't believe it. I got a picture of Gottlieb. And he was also very excited. Then a couple of hours later, he writes back and he says, wait a minute, we changed our minds. I talked to the people in the design department, and they said, we don't want to use this picture because nobody's going to recognize him. Nobody knows who he is. And so they wound up, instead of a photo of him, they just use a black silhouette. So you can't see anything. And I actually thought that was very appropriate because that was all he was. He was a person who might as well have never existed until years later when he was finally, his cover was finally blown.
Wow, this is Sidney Gottlieb. And let's go back to the LSD thing. It's so phenomenal. So they were giving it to people unknowingly. They just at parties and whatnot. So with that, could you tell us who is Frank Olson?
Frank Olson is the protagonist in one of the most amazing unsolved mysteries of the Cold War, and certainly of the CIA. So Frank Olson was a chemist who worked for the CIA, and he went to work for MK Ultra. So he worked for Sidney Gottlieb. It was a very small group. There were never more than a dozen of them. This was an entirely secret project, run partly at the CIA headquarters, but also through laboratories at Fort Detrick in Maryland. Frank Olson was among the very small core group who knew exactly what MK Ultra was doing because he was doing it. His specialty was aerosol technology, which means how do you make a poison into an aerosol, into a spray. He would conduct experiments, for example, at night. His son told me, he reported this. He'd go in the morning and all the monkeys that he sprayed the night before were dead. And that would be considered a successful experiment. And this began to bother him. And then apparently he was in England and was present at an experiment, an MK Ultra experiment, in which a young British soldier was the victim, and he died. He watched him die, possibly with a spray that he himself had designed. And finally, Frank Olson couldn't take it anymore, and he decided he wanted to leave not only MK Ultra, but the CIA. He wanted to quit. But he had knowledge that could blow the CIA and the United States apart. If anybody knew that what MK Ultra was, the impact on the United States would be huge and global. So not only
that's the torture and the killing and
exactly all the details,
which then what seems like it was bad, but now it seems like it's just common. Go ahead.
Exactly. But certainly it would have been an international scandal that would have devastated the American position in the world. Frank Olson not only wanted to quit, but at one time he spoke to a friend and asked him if he knew a good journalist. Presumably the CIA got wind of this also. Frank Olson was then told by his fellow officers that he had psychological problems. And he was persuaded to be admitted to a psychiatric clinic in New York. But before that could happen, he went out of the 10th floor window of the hotel that he was staying at across the street from Penn Station in New York City, and he died. So that death was reported in the newspapers, a very small item in his hometown paper that I found, as the death of an Army scientist. The suicide of an Army scientist. The person had psychological problems, and he committed suicide by jumping out the window. Now, he didn't work for the Army, definitely. That was a cover. He worked for the CIA. But anyway, that was it. The guy was psychologically disturbed and he committed suicide. So that was the story all the way for the next 20 plus years. Then in 1974, there was the series of scandals that shook the CIA and investigations that went into 1975. And one report mentioned the case of a person who worked for the CIA who was given LSD and then committed suicide. So this put a whole new light on it. And the CIA then revealed the story, which is that about a week before the suicide of Frank Olson, Olson and a few other MK Ultra officers had gone to a retreat at a cabin in Maryland, and that Gottlieb had administered LSD to Frank Olson in a drink unknowingly, maybe in an effort to try to get him to talk about what he was thinking and what he was doing. But in any case, the CIA then admitted that it had inadvertently driven the guy to suicide because they gave him this LSD, and maybe that was the cause of his psychiatric upheaval. So the president of the United States actually brought the family of Frank Olson into the Oval Office and apologized. That's the only time that's ever happened in CIA history. And the family accepted a financial settlement with the caveat, you're giving up your right to sue ever in the future. But anyway, that's the new story. He wasn't just depressed. The CIA gave him LSD, that made him crazy, and that's why he jumped out the window. But then comes story number 3. Finally, after the widow died, the older son decided he wants to follow this case, and he had the body exhumed. It had already turned out that Gottlieb was the apparent author of a murder manual that the CIA had produced for use in Vietnam, and that later was used in Latin America. And one of the points in that manual was the best way to get rid of someone is to throw him from a high window. But you should always smack him very hard in the forehead so he loses consciousness already. So they opened up the tomb, the coffin of Frank Olson, and sure enough, he had a big fat bruise on his forehead. The story of how there was a roommate in there, the deputy director of the MK Ultra, Gottlieb's deputy was in the hotel room with Frank Olson, and he described Olson running across the room and diving through the window. Years later, the police detective who I interviewed showed me the whole thing, and he described me how crazy the explanation was. It wouldn't be possible to run. He showed me the room is still there. It hasn't been renovated. You couldn't dive this way. You couldn't. And besides, why would you run across the room? You just open the window and go out. Anyway, many, many other details suggest that he was helped out that window. However, there's never been any definitive proof. And I devote a chapter in the book to telling this story, which is really unique in CIA history. We don't know of any other case where the CIA might have decided it had to kill one of its own senior officers. And that might well have been what happened with Frank Olson. Put yourself in the place of his CIA superiors. The costs are too high. They're in the middle of the Cold War. If somebody has to die, this is war. So it's certainly understandable from their perspective.
Yeah, suicide is always the main thing. Ask Jeffrey Epstein. Oh, excuse me. So Olson died, committed suicide. So was this common? He was LSD laced unknowingly. I think was it at a party? Were they just throwing stuff? So if I go to this party, I might be getting LSD. Is that correct?
Well, that happened at other places. I even found a memo from the CIA security director right before one of the office Christmas parties at the CIA. It said, don't drink out of the punch bowl, because Sidney Gottlieb sometimes puts stuff in there that you wouldn't want to drink.
So he was okay.
So yeah, he was known to be fascinated with putting LSD in people's drinks. And I think this is what happened at this retreat. So it wasn't just a party. That was a weekend retreat or it was described as a weekend retreat for MK Ultra, the inner core. They all had covers of saying they were working for some magazine or something. But anyway, they all got together. And it's never been entirely clear what exactly was the purpose. I think, though, as I mentioned, maybe they wanted to see if they could get more out of Frank Olson and see how dangerous he was. But he reacted against it. I think he probably figured out what was happening and sort of did not want to cooperate at all. Anyway, you can imagine how a decision might have been made, and Frank Olson might be the only CIA senior officer who was killed by the CIA.
Wow, this is so fascinating. So the CIA was doing some dastardly things. Could you talk about their war on jazz musicians? And they arrested Billie Holiday. I guess I would assume this whole mentality was, patriotism, and I'm guessing white nationalism, because the Expendables were partly, I don't know, I'm just assuming this. The Expendables were used probably folks who were people of color or those bad Russians.
Well, the person you're referring to is George White, who was a famous agent of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, or its predecessor, way back in the 1950s. And he's a connection between drug prosecutions and persecution of jazz musicians in New York and the CIA, particularly MK Ultra. So this guy was really a crazy character, White. He was short and very fat. Someone described him as looking like a dangerous bowling ball, bald head. Anyway, he was a senior officer of the a drug officer in New York City, and he was eager to, as I guess all enforcement officers were in that time, persecute Black people. And he didn't like the whole jazz idea. Naturally, it was a place where free Black expression was flowering, and he got especially angry at Billie Holiday. And I think he wrote this or said this to people. It was her style that she reveled in being a celebrity. She wore fancy dresses and tiaras, and she went in a fancy car. And for some reason, this really set White off. And I think White was involved in either entrapment or close surveillance of Billie Holiday. Anyway, he persecuted her. He was after her, and what might have helped contribute to her decline. So what's the connection to MK Ultra? So being a person who was really in the deep netherworld, White would always he was a drug user while he was arresting people for using drugs. He was always ready to try everything that he confiscated. So he got
Go ahead.
He then got in touch with Gottlieb. Gottlieb heard about him, and Gottlieb went to talk to him. So Gottlieb is this studious chemist, and White is this real streetwise tough guy. So they really complemented each other. And White was then hired by Gottlieb to be a consultant for MK Ultra, and they came up with this crazy idea that they would open a bordello. They'd actually open a national security whorehouse in New York City, in Greenwich Village. And they did. It was a place where girls would bring men back and then lace their drinks with various kinds of whatever drug combination Gottlieb wanted to test that week. And it was so successful that they decided to do it on a larger scale in San Francisco. And so Gottlieb was transferred to San Francisco as the head of drug enforcement there. And at the same time, he was running the national security whorehouse up overlooking San Francisco Bay. And there you had really a parody of investigation. So the idea was to see if LSD or other drugs in combination with sex would make men act in certain ways. And so there was no science involved. It could have been a scientific experiment, but it wasn't. There were no experts on anything, on sexology, on psychology present. It was just this big fat drug agent, George White, sitting behind a one-way mirror on a portable toilet and drinking cocktails out of a pitcher. And that was supposed to be this investigation of whether drugs, whether And guess what? They found out that after sex, some men are more willing to talk than they were before.
Yeah.
Huge surprise. But you know, the whole idea of U.S. government setting up a bordello in San Francisco, complete with sex toys and all Toulouse-Lautrec drawings on the wall and everything, is mind-boggling enough. But I always wondered what he really had in mind in doing that. And as I was going deeper into the research for Poisoner in Chief, I came up with what might be a possible explanation, because I found out on Long Island in the garage of a very old guy who had been a lawyer in a case against Gottlieb decades earlier, a deposition by a guy who was White's deputy. This drug agent's deputy was working with him and going to that whorehouse with him to help supervise everything. And he told me, or he didn't tell me, he told the investigator, and now I read this document, which I don't think anybody had looked at before. He said, Sidney Gottlieb was always interested in women. As soon as he came out, the first thing that he wanted from me was, get me a girl. And I would always get him. It was one girl after another. And the girl, and he also adds proudly in the deposition, the girls never charged him. They did it as a favor to me. So then I began to think, maybe the entire reason for the whole project in San Francisco was to give this 40-something bureaucrat in Washington, a free reason to go to San Francisco and do everything he couldn't do at home.
Wow. So I'm gonna look at the culture. This whole experiment, LSD experimentation, created a whole culture. Matter of fact, there's a song by a group called Muse, MK Ultra, who won a Grammy. It said the wavelength gently grows, coercive notions re-evolve, a universe is trapped inside a tear. It resonates the core, creates unnatural laws, replaces love and happiness with fear. Those are some of the lyrics to this song. My goodness. So it seems like it created a whole culture. This was recently, I think, was at the 80s, but then also back in the 50s when it was going on, the film industry, because the whole concept, idea of mind control. So you had all these sci-fi films taking after what they were trying to do. Could you talk about that for a second?
It's an interesting story because there are two ends of it. What created MK Ultra and what MK Ultra created. So I think one of the reasons that senior officers at the CIA would have been ready to believe that there's such a thing as mind control is that they saw a lot of movies and they read a lot of novels and a lot of short stories and Sherlock Holmes and movies about a guy swinging a watch in front of somebody's eyes and then she's under your power, or you got a diplomat who is hypnotized and he goes maybe you put a pill in his drink and then you whisper into his ear and he goes back to his embassy and takes out all the secret documents and gives them to you. So I think they figured, well, if cinematographers and novelists can come up with this stuff, well, we could make it real. So again, the fantasy bled into reality. It was just a fantasy, but they took it for reality. But then the other part of it is that the whole existence of a CIA super secret project to investigate the human mind with the intent of taking it over became so widely circulated, particularly beginning, I think, with the movie The Manchurian Candidate. Actually, that it spawned an entire new industry of MK Ultra songs and MK Ultra references in novels. MK Ultra has become something like the perfect example of the notorious, devastating secret CIA experiments. And I can see why, because so much of that is true. But it's interesting how popular culture kind of shaped MK Ultra, and then MK Ultra shaped popular culture. However, one of the things that some of the people involved in that project later observed was that at the end, in the end of the 1950s, early 60s, Gottlieb was under pressure. A lot of people at the CIA didn't like what he was doing. And finally, MK Ultra petered out, and Gottlieb wrote a final note essentially saying, I concluded mind control doesn't exist. There's no such thing. And People had been telling him that. Some other psychologists had told him that years earlier. But he finally said, it doesn't exist. So with that, one section of that research ended. So, and I've often thought back to that now. So Gottlieb probably by that time knew more about mind control possibilities than anybody in the world. And so he said, it doesn't exist. And I believe him. He was right. However, he was right at the time he was speaking. That was, what, almost 2/3 of a century ago. I mean, the advances in computer technology, in cyber knowledge, in AI, create entire new schemes of possibilities for neuro research. So nobody in America or even in the US government had the slightest idea that MK Ultra was going on. I ask myself, isn't it likely that if that happened in the 1950s, that it would be going on now? Wouldn't you expect that the CIA and perhaps other agencies in other countries would be trying to figure out how to use these techniques as a way to seize control of minds? So maybe it's possible to say Gottlieb was right when he said there's no such thing as mind control, but he was only right when he said it. And I'm wondering if there's going to be another Stephen Kinzer decades from now who'll write another version of Poisoner in Chief about what was really happening back in the 2020s.
Exactly. Why would they stop? Which brings us up to current times. But before we go, we're running out of time quickly. Damn God. You mentioned John Lennon. There was Bob Marley. These people were murdered, and of course they were very popular. They were very outspoken, and they could create. Anyway, let me just go to my question. Do you think they were murdered? There was a guy who actually said that he killed Bob Marley, put something in his shoe to give him like a poison, but it was not verified, and he killed Bob Marley. What's your thoughts on these high-profile people being murdered? And in contemporary, you look at what's his name, Charlie Kirk.
I'd add a couple of other names that often come up in this connection. One is the Unabomber. He was involved in some a subject of some experiments at Harvard with drugs. Another one is Sirhan Sirhan. He seems to have had some kind of hypnotic effect. So all of these are interesting cases. Unfortunately, for me, that's in another realm. My books are all factual. Everything in there comes from a source. The part of my book that I'm always the proudest of is the footnotes. Everything is real. So I think those are interesting and intriguing areas for writers or others to follow. I'm just not that writer. Whatever I write, it really happened. And let me tell you, it's hard to believe, even at this stage, for me, to wrap my mind around everything that MK Ultra was and everything that Sidney Gottlieb did. It is truly one of the great unknown stories of American history.
And as we wrap up, you used to work for the New York Times, is that correct?
It is indeed.
So that some people would say the media is mind control, specifically today. What's your thoughts on when you worked there? Was it creating a narrative for control and imperialism, et cetera, and compare that with today?
I think there was an element of that, but it wasn't nearly as great as it is today. Mm-hmm. I mean, today I see the press as fawning lackeys of power. They're just essentially like stenographers who take down what is fed to them and spread it out. I feel like the press is one of the most insidious institutions these days in America, and it's not even the old press that we used to know. It's the takeover of media corporations by billionaires who have their own agendas that align with government figures. And the political system of the United States, which is essentially a form of legalized bribery, gives those people who are able to purchase media empires also the right to purchase political office holders. And so that creates a situation that really makes it important for individuals to go out and look for the news on their own and not be spoon-fed. Always question the narrative. Mark Twain is one of my heroes, and here's a line that I'll close with. The majority is always wrong. When you find yourself on the side of the majority, it is time to reform.
Wow. That's Stephen Kinzer, everybody. Thank you so much, man. Hopefully I could
Okay,
invite
this
you
went
back
well. I'm
again.
so glad we did it. You did a great job. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, you know, you were the one who did a great job on this book, so that's it. Poison the
That's a
Chief.
good combination. Okay,
Yeah,
thanks a lot.
all right. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Support comes from UCLA Center for the